think that we should do the Lord's Supper? Communion, the Eucharist, whatever you want to call it. Does anybody have a thought, an opinion? How often do you think that we should observe the Lord's Supper? Quarterly is what our bylaws say. I think it says every fifth Sunday, which makes it quarterly. Yeah, that's right. And just to be completely honest, we missed, I think, June. And but the deacons met a couple weeks ago and said we'll do it at Christmas and somewhere around that time. So that'll kind of make up for it. But yeah, we try to do it quarterly. What do you think? Do you think it matters? You don't think it matters? Okay. Unless we don't do it, right? Okay. Anybody wish we did it more? All right. The reason I'm asking is because some of the things that we talked about last week is how would you describe what we're doing in the Lord's Supper to a first-time guest, someone who had never been here, someone who didn't grow up in the Baptist church? How would you explain what it is we're doing? Now, we had the same conversation last week about baptism, and you had some great answers. Do you have any answers for what would you say to someone to describe the Lord's Supper? What would you tell them?
It's something we do in remembrance.
That's right.
Can't give you the word of something that happens that we're supposed to do in the Bible. It's part of the Last Supper.
That's right.
The reason why we are all forgiven.
Yeah. Yeah.
Before he is crucified.
Right.
It is our way of honoring.
That's good. That's good.
Honoring his name with that.
Right. Yes, sir, Mike. Right. So I want you to try to remove yourself from the history of church. And I know, like Sarah grew up Catholic, and so you had a version of the. Did you do it every week? Catholic church, Catholic Mass. Every day. Wow, every day. And so, if you can, a little bit, remove yourself from it, and try to see what we're doing as though it was the first time you've ever seen it, right? Because I think to new people, they would have a hard time grasping it, understanding it, and I want to be able to explain that to folks. I don't think we're going to get a lot of people here on a Sunday that have never seen it. You know what I mean? I think most people that come have some history, have some knowledge, and if you're familiar with American Protestantism at all, you kind of know. But I want you to understand it. I want me to understand it better and to be able to give an answer, right? And so it is something that we do to honor, to remember. Absolutely. Jesus said to do it in remembrance. We talked last week about baptism being a symbol. Okay. And so there are some different opinions about what happens at the Lord's Supper and why we do it, right? How many of you saw, and I'm hesitant to bring this up, but how many of you watched the opening ceremonies of the Olympics? Did any of you actually watch it? Later? Okay. So has everybody seen it now? Seen pictures, seen the idea? Saw the headlines, right? Yeah. If you're on any kind of social media, you've seen the response, right? How do you think the Christian community responded? What do you think about it, really? Do you think we did the right thing? Do you think you do, Jeff? Is that what you said? Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. That's good. Probably a lot of people agree with you in here. Go ahead, Mike. Go ahead. Right. When they, yeah. That's right. Yeah. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, the opening ceremony of the Olympics in Paris, they had and it was hard to watch any of it. It was very confusing and fast moving, and even the weather was bad. It was raining, and so they had this one scene that looked an awful lot like the Lord's Supper. Da Vinci's painting of the Lord's Supper, all seated on the same side of the table, facing this way. I think that not all of them were transgender, but a lot of them were. A lot of them were, I guess, what you would call, cross dressers. And then the lady in the middle, was, I don't know what she was supposed to look like, but she had a big thing on her head, and so it seemed pretty obvious that that's what it was. They came out and said that they were actually depicting something else, but now they've come out and said they're sorry because it was disrespectful and clearly was about the Lord's Supper. So here's the point. People just don't understand it. People don't know. I think the majority of responses that I've seen have been one side or the other. Christians are offended, and they're writing about it, and they're demanding an apology. Even some churches and some clergy have stepped out, and I think the Catholic leadership asked for an apology. They have received one. So you see kind of that response, and then you see the other side, and this one seems to be louder to me, as people that are saying it's not a big deal. Why does it offend you so much? That wasn't the purpose, so on and so forth. So what makes this so much worse is the social media aspect, is that we all get to see the constant back and forth of what's happening. The reason I bring it up is because I think it was offensive. I think it was ridiculous, to be honest. The only shred of hope that I see in it, the only light at the end of that tunnel that I see is why do people continue to bash Christianity? It must be because we're right. It must be because there's truth to it, right? They weren't making fun of any other religion, any other belief system. You don't see that in the mainstream media. So what you see is this constant attack on Christianity. I feel like the reason that they're obsessed with it is because they know that there's truth, and Jesus is real. And so I find a little bit of hope in that. You know what I mean? That it's still there. It's still a point of discussion, right? And so we serve a very real God who will not be mocked. And so I think that time is coming. I really do. I feel like God is. He's got to be tired of us, right? He's got to be tired of what's going on. I know we are. And so when it comes to the Lord's Supper, I want you to have some knowledge of what it is, what it means. How do we approach it? And I asked you this last week, do the elements, do the things, do the ways that we do it make a difference? I want you to be prepared for this, okay? So the word, the biblical word for Lord's Supper or whatever is called Eucharist. It's Greek. It means to gratify, right? So this was what Jesus was saying when he said, do this in remembrance of me. Means that we are participating in a living memorial to Jesus. We are gratifying that memory, like saying, hey, we're doing this. And there's nothing weird about that to me. So if I'm explaining the Lord's Supper to someone, I'm going to say, we do this because Jesus said to physically do something in order to remember him. We do that kind of stuff all the time, right? We visit landmarks. We visit grave sites. We visit places where we met certain people or remember folks, things that will allow us to remember people. Sometimes we have family traditions because we want to remember a family member well, right? I think this is very similar, is that Jesus said, I want you to do this so that you remember what it means. Okay, so this memorial, and just to give you and I'm not going to give you any history really, but this memorial, as far as the Baptist religion is concerned, the Baptist denomination is concerned, has always been listed as one of the two ordinances, right? This is the thing that Jesus said that we were supposed to do. Now, the hard part for me is because they're so very different, right? The two ordinances, to me, are almost on different levels, okay? Because we are baptized, and we talked about this last week, baptized as believers. A believer baptism is what we teach. And so that's a choice for every person that meets Jesus. You make the decision to be baptized, and you do it once. You know, in theory, you do it once. And that's your symbol. That's your obedience, right? The thing about the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper, to me, being an ordinance, is it's harder for me to decide how often we're supposed to do it. Because with both of them being on the same level as as ordinances, I have a hard time differentiating how often should we do it. Is it once forever? Obviously not. Is it something that we just do? And so where do you get these pictures? How do we find out in Scripture how much we're supposed to do it? Okay, so if you will turn with me, you're probably already there, 1 Corinthians chapter 11. What you see in 1 Corinthians is Paul writing to a group of believers with some encouragement. He's telling them what they're doing and how they're doing. He gives some examples. He tells them, this is the way that you're supposed to live the Christian life, flee from idolatry, give God glory. You get to chapter 11, he's a little more specific, right? He's talking about head coverings. And then what we're going to do is get chapter 11, starting in verse 17, where he starts to summarize how to handle this thing called the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist, right? Okay, so verse 17, chapter 11. Now, in giving these instructions, I do not praise you. Okay, so automatically there's a difference. Right here, verse 17, there's a difference in the way that Paul is talking to the Corinthian church. He says, I'm not praising you for this. So they're doing it wrong, right? So he's saying, you're not doing it right. Okay, this is what he says. Since you come together, not for the better, but for the worse. For first of all, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and in part I believe it. For there must also be factions among you, that those who are approved may be recognized among you. Therefore, when you come together in one place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. For in eating, each one takes his own supper ahead of others, and one is hungry and another is drunk. What, do you not have houses to eat and drink in, or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? I do not praise you. Let's just keep reading. Verse 23. For I received from the Lord that which is also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus on the same night in which he was betrayed took bread, and when he'd given thanks, he broke it and said, take, eat, this is my body which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And in the same manner, he also took the cup after supper, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. This do as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. As often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death till he comes. Okay, so do you see this progression, right? Where Paul is talking about, and I need you to help me. Why does Paul talk about in verse 20, they come together to not eat the Lord's Supper, and then he qualifies it by saying, you're not coming together to eat the Lord's Supper because there are factions among you, that you eat ahead of other people. He says that's not the Lord's Supper, and then he reminds them, starting in verse 23, how they're supposed to do it, like there's this process. So what are they doing wrong? What do you think that they're missing? For Paul to start like this, I do not praise you in this. What do you think they're doing wrong? I'm sorry? Lack of unity. Okay? That's good.
you don't know how they got fed by their masters. So this was an opportunity then for them to eat. And Paul is saying there are people that bring the food were hoarding it in some sense. People
Okay.
probably wasn't great, they were hoarding it, and they were acting like jerks to the other people.
So what Jimmy's talking about, I think, is called the love feast, right? The agape feast. It was a meal that they would have before they took the Lord's Supper, right? So we'll talk about this a little bit, but I want you to see it. What they would do is they would come to church and they would have, no joke, they'd have like a potluck. They have a potluck meal where certain people brought certain things. You brought stuff to the meal, and this was before the Lord's Supper. So what was happening was that the Corinthian church specifically, what was happening in those what Jimmy called house churches, is that they were partying. They were eating the food, and what he's talking about is that the wealthy people would bring certain foods and eat their food only, and they would bring their wine and drink their wine only, and the poorer population, those less fortunate, wouldn't have anything to eat, and they wouldn't have anything to drink. And so what they did, because of that setup and that system, what they did was they moved the love feast to after the Lord's Supper. So they started having, church and Lord's Supper or Eucharist, and then like a feast. And what was happening was people were using that as an excuse just to party all night, and they were getting drunk and having major problems. So what they ended up doing ultimately was just getting rid of the love feast altogether. We're not going to have that thing because people weren't handling it well, right? So Paul starts to equate, and I don't want you to get these confused, but Paul is talking about the way that they were acting, as in they were having a fellowship and partying and calling it the Lord's Supper, saying that they were experiencing or that they were partaking of an ordinance. All they were doing was showing up and eating their own food and drinking their own wine and finding an excuse to get drunk and to party. Okay, so Paul was saying this is an issue, right? So here are some things that I wrote down when it comes to the Lord's Supper and how you and I are supposed to approach it. All right. From the beginning of this passage, verses 17 through 22, I wrote down the Lord's Supper is a serious matter. All right. Now I got to stand up because some of you know this. I think I'm a serious person. You know what I mean? I get a lot of folks will say, "Why are you not smiling?" When you're happy, and I don't mean to be a serious person. I think I'm just in my head a lot. But I don't like formality a whole lot. Okay, some of you know that we've talked about it. I don't know that I love things that feel stiff. And so I like for people to be comfortable, and I like to kind of go with the flow as much as I can. And so what that means is a lot of times the things that we do in church, to me, this is not gospel, this is just my opinion. A lot of things that we do in church feel stuffy to me. They feel, tradition is good, but sometimes we do things for the sake of tradition and they don't feel right to me. You know what I mean? And so I ask questions, why do we do these things and what's going on? And so this is why I'm telling you all this, because it's hard for me to think that the Lord's Supper is serious. It's hard for me to think that because I feel like we should be able to just do it however we want. I feel like we should be able to just, hey, let's do this every week, but let's make it easy and let's make it kind of fun. Let's have a good time with it. But I read these scriptures and I pray on it and I think about it, and I've come to the conclusion that both of the ordinances, baptism and the Lord's Supper, are serious, and they're serious matters. That doesn't mean that you can't have fun with it. It doesn't mean that you can't even be creative. What it means is that we have to take it seriously. And I'm confessing to you that it's hard for me, because I feel like there are so many people showing up here on a Sunday morning that don't get it. And so many people that go, why are you taking this so seriously? And I want to be able to say, well, because it is. Paul said that it was a big deal. Jesus said it was a big deal. It has to be something that's serious. So in chapter 11, verse 28, Paul talks about, we're going to read this in a minute, but he talks about this self-examination. All right. This is how Paul is explaining that we're supposed to take the Lord's Supper seriously. Verse 27, start there. Therefore, whoever eats this bread or drinks this cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. But let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For he who eats and drinks in an unworthy manner eats and drinks judgment to himself, not discerning the Lord's body. For this reason, many are weak and sick among you, and many sleep. For if we would judge ourselves, we would not be judged. But we are judged. We are chastened by the Lord, that we may not be condemned with the world. Right? So Paul is, if you think about it, he's really echoing some of the things that Jesus talked about, especially in Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus was saying the person who is out of harmony with other members of the body dishonors the Lord's Supper. So we have to come to things like this with baptism and the Lord's Supper, self-examining, making sure that we're ready, making sure that our hearts are in the right place. That's why, and I don't know that I'm real good at it, but one of the things that I want to do before the Lord's Supper is give people a moment, give people some time to fix their stuff, right? Come down front and pray, get right with the Lord. I mean, I don't know what that means for a lot of people, but the Lord's Supper has to be serious. It has to be something that we do that is where we self-examine. We start to look into ourselves. Let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of the bread and drink of the cup. So Paul is saying, hey, this is a big deal, serious matter. I would say that one of the things I've enjoyed about my church experience, and I've been in a Baptist church my whole life, I believe. I don't think I've visited other churches, but never, really been in them. I've liked historically the way that we as a church, we as a denomination have approached the Lord's table. I've liked it. There's a level of reverence. It doesn't feel stuffy to me. There is an element of traditionalism, but it doesn't feel like we're doing it for the wrong reasons. It feels good to me. I want to continue talking about that with you in a church and leaders of what can we do to make the Lord's Supper make sense to people, and also do it with reverence, right? It has to be serious. Then here's the next thing I wrote down, and this was Mike's point. We must be unified before we take the Lord's Supper. Unified, right? Now, Paul talks about it in those verses, but he talks about it a little bit more here. First, verse 18, when you come together as a church, there are divisions among you, and in part I believe it. For there are factions among you, those who are approved may be recognized among you. Therefore, when you come together in one place, it's not to eat the supper. For in eating, each one takes his own ahead of others. So Paul is saying that we've got to be unified. Now, what do you think that means? Like, really, can you give me some ideas? What do you think it means that we as a church are unified? The last time we did the Lord's Supper here, the last time, because we missed one. That was an accident. But the one before that, how many of you remember that we did it backwards? Rhonda, I know you remember. You told me. How many of you remember that we did it backwards? My mom does. Does anybody else? Some of you? Do you remember, kind of? Okay. I will never do that again, I don't think. And you were very generous. The people that came up and said, it's okay, but I've never done that. I got kind of lost in the Bible, in the verses, and we took the drink first and then the bread. And listen, I know that you're with me. That's not a huge deal, right? But I want to do it what feels right. I want to do what feels comfortable. You know what I mean? And we've done it the other way my whole life and probably your whole life. And when you read this passage and passages, when you just go straight through the verse, that's the way it is. Jesus said, take, eat. This is my body, which is broken for you. Okay, so that to me, I apologize for that. I know that you're generous. I know that you're not upset. That to me is not what Scripture's talking about being unified. Okay, so what do you think it is? What does it mean for us to be unified? I know it's a big question, but just give me some ideas. What do you really think? Concerning what? Okay, so theology, doctrine. Y'all agree with that? Everybody agree with that? Do you think that we are unified in doctrine? Do you have any doubts? There probably are some small things, right, that we might not even disagree, but we could talk about, we could debate. But I believe, being here a year and a half and going through the search committee process and meeting with people, I believe that you and I and we together agree on the essentials of doctrine, and probably 98% of the others, right? We're very similar. And most of the people in this church, even if they don't know it, you know what I mean? We tend to believe the same way. Okay, so that's one way we're unified. What else? This microphone's broken. Got a crack on it. What else? How else are we unified? I really want to know, what else do you think matters? We're unified, man, sir? Right. Okay. That's right. So we agree on Christ, right? That's part of doctrine. You talk about prayer. We need to be unified in prayer. Do you think it matters that we agree on other things? One of the things that I say a lot is preference, right? Yeah, we all have different preferences, don't we? I'm kind of hot right now. Some of you would not like it. Ooh, Rhonda's warm. You would not like it if we turned the air down, and got colder. And that's not even a preference. That's like a comfort thing, right? You think it's important that we agree on the temperature? To an extent. That's right, yeah. I want you to think about it. I want you to think about, because here's the deal. As we continue to minister and serve, and I think grow spiritually, grow numerically, what's going to happen is we are going to continually notice things about each other and about the way church is happening. We're going to continually see that. Okay, so I would just ask you, it's not even really part of my notes, but I would just ask you to think about it. What does it take to be unified as we go into the Lord's Supper? And maybe because of that, we need to do it more often. But what does it look like? Because we can disagree on certain things and still be unified as a body and as a church. And so help me figure that out. We're going to be talking about that a little bit more in the coming days. But I want you to know we must be unified before we take the Lord's Supper. And I believe that is primarily on the subject of doctrine and belief, what you were saying. I believe it's primarily that. But also as a church, what are we doing? Where are we going? Okay, so then Paul gives us the significance of the supper. He starts to sort of explain what that's going to look like. That's in verse 23, verse 32. We read all those, right? I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you. And then he tells that story, okay? Now then, here's where it gets pretty amazing, right? Is that Paul takes some time to give us a suggestion. And he says, this is the way that it's supposed to be. So all of chapter 10, all of chapter 11, he's talking about what things happen in the church. And then in verse 27, there's that really important word, therefore. It's like he's summing it all up, right? He's saying all this stuff that we've talked about, we're going to come to this place. All of these things lead to this conclusion. Therefore, whoever eats this bread or drinks this cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. Somebody tell me what you think that means. What would it look like to take the body and the blood in an unworthy manner? Okay. So you think it's about personal relationships? Could be about sin. Okay, heart has to be right with God. Here's one of the things that I say often, and this is just me, Miss Sarah, you probably heard me say it, is I believe that I think that Christianity is all about relationships. You know what I mean? And so when Jesus summed up the 10 Commandments, the law, he gave us 2. That was about our relationship to God and then our relationship to each other. Those were the 2 most important things, right? And so I think all of life is about relationships, but I think even more than that, Christianity is about relationships, how we relate to God and how we relate to each other. And so those are the 2 things that you have to think about when he says, you've got to examine that. That's what you've got to work on. Have you ever sat in church and realized that there was someone in the room that you needed to forgive or say or apologize to? Has that ever happened? I remember doing this as a teenager in a revival. Do you remember this? The church that I grew up in, that Mom took us to, our family went to Broadmoor. We did like kind of revivals, and one of them, I don't remember which one it was. Life Action. They would do this thing. They would say, if you have an issue with somebody in the room, you need to deal with it. And I remember people moving, and they gave us rules. They said, if that person doesn't know that you're mad at them, you don't need to tell them. You don't need to go up and say, I've been talking about you bad and I've been saying stuff and I'm sorry. You don't have to do that. But they taught us how to fix it. That was so important to me. It's such a big deal. You have to confess. Yes, absolutely. And so you talk about relationships and fixing things with each other. But then also what you were saying is that we've got to fix it with the Lord, right? We've got to get that right. Sin in our life, unconfessed sin, whatever it is. We've got to deal with it. Yeah. All right. Bring it.
All right. Somebody's got it on King James. What the word unworthily? Ly indicates an adverb. An adverb never modifies nouns. Okay. What Paul was getting at here, because even New King James, they try to strengthen things in the word now. What Paul is talking about here is how they were doing or something. It's how they were doing it. That's what he's fussing about.
So Paul is fussing about the method?
The method.
Okay.
Because, words mean things.
Yeah.
Okay. Because I grew up in, and this is why this is so important to me when I learned this. I grew up in a church. The Lord's Supper was the worst Sunday, 4 worst Sundays of the year.
Okay.
Because the pastor would beat you to death. It was the hardest sermon, 4 hardest sermons. You need to, if you drink this cup, you got one Sunday, you forget the whole focus. The whole focus is on Jesus Christ. Okay. There ain't nobody that's ever, besides him, that's been worthy to take on something. We're showing with his bread and his blood that we are not worthy, but he died for us anyway. And so what happens is the Lord's Supper becomes instead of focusing on Christ, it becomes a place of introspection.
Right. Okay. So what does that mean for us when we talk about method then? Because what they were doing wrong was that they were taking it selfishly, right? All right. So I'm okay with this. This is great. Jimmy points out that it's not supposed to be about us. No matter how much time we spend asking for forgiveness and coming up here and fixing relationships, we're still unworthy.
But the thing is, once you focus on Christ, this stuff's going to come up.
Right.
It's going. The Lord will bring out things to you that you need to make it right.
Okay.
But that's a byproduct of focusing on Christ.
All right. So unworthily, as an adverb, modifies the word eats and drinks. Right? Go ahead. All right. Well, we don't have that problem when it comes to the Lord's Supper, do we? Okay. So what can we learn from it? I like it when we go a different direction. What can we learn from it? Because I know Jimmy, he's not saying don't examine. He's not saying you don't examine yourself. Clearly we do, but the focus has to be on Christ. So do we learn anything from this passage about the method or the style? Do we learn anything from it? Does it matter? Yeah. I only hear every few words that you're saying. I'm sorry. I can't hear you. No. And if I can't, I know.
What I'm saying is, we have learned, I think, because he was chastising them for not waiting on each other. That's it.
Okay. Yeah.
And we do wait on each other.
We do. Yeah.
So, and also he was saying, like he said, some people are
Mm-hmm.
drinking too much, they may get
Mm.
wrong.
You leave it out for a while, it might. But that's good. And I think it's important that we serve each other, don't you? I think it's neat, but I also think that it's important that they were serving. But what are the things that matter in the way that we do it? Right.
It's interesting that he tells the Corinthians that the Lord told him not to do this, but if you think about it, all the next last supper.
Right. Okay. Well, we saved the best for last, just like Paul, who's writing here, verse 33. He gives us another therefore, right? And then he sums it up again. It's pretty neat. Therefore, my brethren, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. But if anyone is hungry, let him eat at home, lest you come together for judgment. And the rest I will set in order when I come. So what Paul is saying is, so much of what we do here is about our attitude. It's about serving one another, coming together, being unified. But then he kind of changes it with verse 34. He changes focus to say, it's not about the eating. Don't take the Lord's Supper. And I know that we don't do this, but they were using the Lord's Supper as a place that they could get full and they could eat and they could drink wine. And Paul says, if you're hungry, eat at home. That's not what it's for. And I guess I'm, coming off of what Jimmy says, I would say the same thing about, we don't come here to take the Lord's Supper to cleanse ourselves, to make it right, to feel better about anything. If you want those things, if you need those things, if you're hungry, eat at home. This is a time where we come together to remember, right? So the Lord's Supper, right? It's and what's difficult about it is that we don't have anything in Scripture that really prescribes a method. Okay, I want to talk about the elements. You know what I mean? I promise they weren't drinking out of the little bitty measuring cups. You know what I mean? The little bitty things that we have. That they weren't doing that. I promise they weren't using the little crackers. They didn't have the plates where all the cups fit in the holes. Okay, I don't know what it looked like for them. I imagine that in a lot of ways it was just whatever they had on hand. Okay, and so I don't want us to get real bogged down in those details. I want you with me to examine ourselves, but also to examine what's important. And I'm not trying to change the Lord's Supper. Please hear me say that. I'm not trying to change it. I'm saying we got to determine what our preferences and what's important. When it comes to these types of things, when it comes to our beliefs, how it governs what we do as a church and where we're going, we've got to be able to differentiate between those things. And I think you're doing a great job. I think we're doing a great job. I think what's happening at this church is wonderful. And I'm excited about where the Lord is leading us. I really am. I just want you to know that the Lord's Supper and both of the ordinances will play a huge part in the growth of this church. We will constantly teach them. We will believe in them. We will practice them. We will do them the way that not only Scripture teaches, but the way that the Baptist Church has done them for a really long time. It'll be important to us. Okay, any questions, any thoughts? Thank you so much for feedback and talking. I enjoy that. I really do. It helps a lot. Okay. Anything else? Anything I miss? Great. I'd like to take some prayer requests. We'll kind of wrap up with this, but to hear from you, some things that are going on. Don't forget that Frank Beach, there's a memorial at his house this Sunday. If you need that address or something, you can come up to, you can call the church, or it's in the directory. It's at his house this Sunday, I think from like 2 to 4. Does that sound right, Ira? Something like that. Bob Reed is in Ave Maria. Can somebody tell me where that is? Huh? It's at the church? Right behind it? Okay. Okay. So Bob is there. I saw Bob in the hospital. He's doing okay. He's there. Is Nana back? She's still in the hospital, do we know? Okay. You probably didn't know, but Nana Ashley was in the hospital, had some chest pain, seems to be doing fine. As far as I know, they haven't really found anything. So pray for them. All right. Who else? What am I missing? Go ahead.